Good morning, Zimbabwe. Welcome once again. This is Zimbabwe Daily. I'm your host today on this platform. My name is Yvonne Muchaka, and I do hope I find all of you well. Invite others, call the others. Today is International Human Rights Day, and it also marks the end of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. So I do hope you're going to follow up with me as we unpack this issue. Is gender-based violence a human rights issue? What is the state of Zimbabwe's human rights record and status? Join me after this short break as I introduce to you our guest who is going to help me unpack this subject. Good morning, everybody. Yes, I can see that you're calling each other. Please invite others so that we can have this endeavor together. I'll allow my guest to introduce himself. He is no stranger on our Zimbabwe's landscape. So I'm going to allow him to introduce himself. Mr. Dewa, welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me and having me on the show. My name is Dewa Mavhinga. I am a human rights lawyer, a Zimbabwean myself, and currently working with Human Rights Watch as the Southern Africa Director. I am joining in from the UK. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. We want to unpack this whole subject. Is gender-based violence a human rights issue? If you can just share a little bit for us what you understand by what is human rights anyway, and how does that interface with GBV?
Thank you. Yes, today is International Human Rights Day, which is the day that globally we celebrate and commemorate human rights. And human rights are those entitlements that everyone has by virtue of being born, by virtue of being human. And these include the right to equality, the right to non-discrimination, and these rights are enshrined in our Zimbabwean Constitution of 2013. And most important amongst those rights are the rights of a life of dignity, which prohibit any violations, including violence. And when we talk of gender-based violence, that's one of the most serious forms of human rights abuses that we need to highlight. And it takes many forms, but predominantly in the home. There are also forms of gender-based violence that happen in the political space, and we need to be aware of that. And there are laws that are in place to protect human rights, to protect citizens, to protect everyone. But what is important is for everyone, for Zimbabweans, to know their rights and to be able to claim those rights.
Right. You raise a fundamental issue because I don't think many of us actually know our rights. What are some of those, those silent rights that we actually have by virtue of us being alive, being living? What are some of those rights that we enjoy, but maybe we don't actually know?
Well, I think what's important is for Zimbabweans to take time to read the Zimbabwean Constitution, but the rights, and we need to know also that there is this mistaken misconception that human rights are political rights only. That is not correct. Some of the rights that everyone have, there is a philosopher who said human rights begin with breakfast, which means that, the right to food is a fundamental human right. The right to an education for children is a fundamental human right. The right to housing, we have seen, on social media pictures of, house demolitions. People need to understand that there is a right to housing. So most people would call that that bracket of rights, socio-economic rights. The right to potable, clean water for citizens. That's a human right which many do not even know about, because most of the times the focus is on civil and political rights, is on the right to protest. But we also need to know that people have a right to a safe and clean environment, they have a right to education, they have a right to sufficient health facilities. So the idea that someone must have the highest standard of mental and physical health, that is a right. But often enough, when people turn up at public hospitals and there is no support, there is no infrastructure, people are not aware that in fact it is a violation of their human rights. So we need to look at all those things and all different types of rights, from civil and political to social and economic to environmental and cultural rights.
Right. And how is Zimbabwe doing in terms of all those rights? I think mostly the political rights have been emphasized on, largely because of our toxic political environment in the country. And I think there has been a lot of emphasis in terms of political rights, the right to demonstrate, etc. But in terms of social and civil rights, as you've mentioned, how are we doing? I mean, we've seen at the beginning of the year, we've seen civil servants going on strike. We have seen, the COVID-19 coming on board and adding on to a plethora of our challenges. Now, how are we doing on those rights index, if there's anything like that?
Well, if we are to put it in context, the current government, let's say from August 2018, had a huge challenge of implementing and fulfilling and protecting rights. So basically, when we talk of human rights, we must know that the government and its institutions are the primary duty bearers who should fulfill people's rights. So if you want to claim your rights, you go to your state, to your government, because the government imposes tax on citizens in order to use that money to fulfill human rights promises. If you look at the numbers, Zimbabwe is doing terribly, but in a silent way, which is not documented. So, for example, you will know that according to the World Food Programme, in 2020, 8.6 million Zimbabweans, about 60% of the population, need food aid. They are facing starvation, so they depend on handouts. And that's frightening. That's a huge cost to human rights. That's a huge violation of human rights, the right to food. We also know that our health infrastructure is literally collapsed. So if you have a loved one who is unwell and you go to hospital, you will find that there is no fulfillment of the right to health, because the hospitals have no doctors who are working, or nurses, or equipment, or even you might be told to buy your own medication, to buy your own equipment to bring to the clinic or to the hospital. So there is a huge violation of the right to health in that regard. And I want to bring another challenge for 2020, which has been massive high-level corruption. When corruption happens, it means that state resources, government resources, are diverted, from national programs to benefit individuals. And if that happens, it means that our rights as citizens are violated. So, for example, if you look at the money that you pay on the road, the toll taxes, Zinara, and everything, and the state of the roads, the number of people who lose their lives needlessly on the Zimbabwean roads. We had a high-profile accident of Genius Kalumbure Jinimbi, which shows that we do not have the resources. Our roads are terrible, and the response mechanism from the hospitals, there are no ambulances that are functional other than in the private sector. So all those things result cumulatively in a violation of human rights, which is not properly documented. Now, talk about COVID-19 and the responses. Talk about, the education sector. The children of Zimbabwe, they do not have that access to high and quality, consistent education. With COVID-19 and the lockdowns and kids having to learn from home, how many kids have access to internet in Zimbabwe? How many kids can learn online? So the right to education is therefore, violated, because there is no access and there are no mechanisms and innovations to ensure that no kid is left behind. Another aspect, is when you look at, child marriages, and it's a big problem in Zimbabwe. but not so much is said about it, where the girl child is still taken into marriage before the age of 18, despite a change in the law. We know that the law now criminalizes that kind of behavior, but it remains spread across Zimbabwe. And it's also a huge violation of many rights, because once the girl child is removed from school, it means that they have no right to a decent future, to an education, to economic employment, and they are, most likely to fall pregnant early, and there are many health challenges that come with that kind of situation. But, unfortunately, it seems there is a narrow focus on an understanding of human rights. Even what's happening in terms of access to land for men and women, we know that, most women do not have access to land in Zimbabwe in terms of land rights. Those are violations of human rights that we need to document. The types of marriages that are there in Zimbabwe, where, if the husband dies, most widows are dispossessed and left with no access to property rights because of some intrusive cultural practices. And again, those are serious violations of human rights.
Right. Right. All right. Thank you so much for putting us into context. Right now, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we are going to go deeper. We are going to interrogate this issue further so that we are all in the same picture and in the same loop. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Zimbabwe Daily. Join us after this short break. Welcome back on Zimbabwe Daily. We are looking at the state of our human rights in Zimbabwe. I'm talking to a human rights lawyer, Mr. Dewa Mavhinga, all the way from his base in London. Mavhinga, now you've put a lot of things into context, and if I'm to put it on a scale, what you've already said shows that we are really struggling in terms of keeping up with the human rights expectations, the right to life, the right to education, the right to food, the right to shelter. Even right now, we are seeing demolitions that are taking place in so many suburbs in Harare. We saw this being taken also in Tungwiza, and we are in the rainy season and stuff like that. What should people do? What is their source of redress when they're faced with such flagrant disregard of their human rights?
Well, thank you. I think the first important step is for people to know their rights. And secondly, to assert or claim their rights. So, for example, people must know that in their communities, if they do not have water, safe and clean water, it's a violation of their rights, and they have to take it up with the authorities. And
which authorities, Mr. Mavhinga?
Okay,
I think people generally know their rights, but even when you go and speak to somebody, nobody actually listens to you. If you are told there's no water, we don't have the pumping capacity. So what do I do, even though I know I have a right to water?
Well, the starting point is, your local councillor, your local MP, your local leadership that is elected, but also there are community groups, community advocacy groups that are out there that assist. There are groups that can also assist, like Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights and others, that have in the past taken the authorities to court to enforce these rights. So people should be aware of that. But first and foremost, as a source of information, the local councillor, the local leadership structure should be held accountable to explain, to provide information, and also at the highest level, the Zimbabwe government, the authorities must prioritize human rights. They must prioritize financial resources, human resources that must go towards the protection of human rights. It's not very difficult if there is commitment. So, for example, these things about, let's say, access to clean water, government can do a lot of things, including providing mobile water units, including exploring cheap ways of harvesting water. There is the rain season. In the rural areas, we used to harvest rainwater and make use of it. So in the urban areas, it can be done if the authorities take a lead and say these are cheaper ways of ensuring access to safe, clean drinking water. So
right.
lacking is the political will. We need to get to a point where human rights are depoliticized and they are only viewed as essential enablements for people to live better lives, lives of dignity, so that when we raise human rights issues, it's not viewed as politics or as partisan politics, but it's simply viewed as raising critical aspects of improving human life for everyone, regardless of political affiliation.
Right. And Yemurai puts it this way, and she's asking this question, whether I feel is really fundamental. What's the use of knowing your rights if they still continue to be violated now? And I think that's a real concern here in Zimbabwe. So when people are looking from elsewhere, they're like, Zimbabweans are docile and stuff like that. But here's the thing, that so many civic society organizations have begun to advocate for keeping up with these rights. There's so many organizations in the communities. There's so many media platforms that have taken to educate the people on their rights. But what's the point if nobody is going to listen to us? I know you've said a political will, but until when? Until when? At what point do we then say, you know what, enough is enough, our rights have been violated enough, now we want them to be upheld? At what point?
Well, that's an important question from Yemurai. But you cannot claim your rights if you do not know them. So I will give an example. If you do not know that rape is a violation of human rights, then it will be difficult to assert your rights. Now, so knowing your rights is the first critical step towards asserting your rights. But the next steps are very important, which mean that firstly, as an individual, it then empowers you to be able to link up with like-minded individuals. So communities can come together and say enough is enough, and no, for example. And communities can come together. So these are groups of individuals who can say, in our community, we have this problem of cholera, and we believe the authorities have failed, and we want to take them to court, because human rights are legal rights to be protected. So you need to know that. But beyond that, there have been cases where, for example, communities have simply said, we will not tolerate, for example, abuses. Let's say in South Africa, there are communities where if there is gender-based violence, there is a system of blowing the whistle, and everyone in the community has that whistle, and it happens, or if there is a criminal, for example. So that kind of response is informed by a knowledge of human rights and a desire to ensure that there is protection. And it also empowers us to approach, for example, the legislators. If you go to parliament and say, and petition, there has been change. There have been some improvements. For example, now we are talking of the criminalization of child marriages. But there was a time when these things were just happening with no legal position. So we have small improvements that we need to build on in order to ensure that people enjoy those rights. So, for example, now if you go to Udiro 5, the demolitions that are happening, how do you, if you don't know that you have a right to protection and to housing, you may not be able to, assert those rights. But if you know that this is a violation of your rights, then those women who are now sleeping out in the open can come together, can identify, residents groups that are there, lawyers groups that are there, to take the process further. For example, I'll give you another example.
But it is the High Court. It is the High Court that gave the orders, and the right to the council or whoever is responsible for these demolitions. So if the courts are giving a go ahead, for example, to demolish people's houses, who do you go to? Even if you want to gather yourselves around and you're being told that you are illegal, then what?
Okay.
What's the recourse?
Now, I can explain to you that if one party goes to court, they can get a court order. But if there is no one to challenge that court order, a court order is not infallible. sometimes it is because no one was there on the other side to challenge. So if they say we have got this request to demolish, and maybe the people are claiming that these are illegal structures, and there is no one who has been there to represent those women and men in Budiro 5, it means that that fails. The other aspect of it is that, you know, simply because you have not asserted your rights, it means the other side wins and proceeds. So if they are, my imagination would be that if there had been a challenge to that process, there is a challenge, then the court order is set aside pending a resolution of that challenge. But if there is no challenge, then the law supposedly takes its course and then people lose out.
Right. Thank you so much, Murai. You are really passionate about this. I can see with your comment, it doesn't work, sir. You can blow the whistle as many times as you can, but still the biggest obstacle is limited resources. So mobilizing communities does not work. It all goes back to the government. I think, you know, Yemurai is speaking from a perspective of somebody who has seen, even when you mobilize the communities, even when you've got a strong case that you feel you have, somehow, somewhere, it's just hitting the brick wall. We're not getting there. We're not getting the kind of response that we need. I mean, earlier on, you mentioned about political will. So I think somehow, that is why everything continues to go around in circles around political lines. You know, right now you can see even the media is awash today. The government is saying it's MDC-led councils. The MDC-led councils are saying it is not us who actually went to court. So it's really confusing to say, okay, so who in these positions should we go to? You know, so that is where the people now questioning to say, how do we assert our rights if the ones who are supposed to uphold, you talk about the legislation, it is the same legislation that we're saying we need to protect our children, that is advocating for 12-year-olds to get contraceptives. It is the same legislation that is calling for amendment of constitution number two, the amendment of our constitution number 2, which amendment has nothing to do with asserting human rights but asserting you know, power and position. So how do we go around that, Mr. Mavhinga?
Well, I must say that, you know, human rights are not given freely on a silver platter. You have to for them, you have to claim them, you have to assert them. This is a struggle for human rights. And it's not a matter of, it's not an easy route, but we need to keep fighting on. And the example that you raised about constitutional amendments number 2, that's a perfect example of where there is need to mobilize the masses to say no to those amendments. Because now there is a small movement, you know, that is emerging, but you need more people to come out and reject those amendments. And also there is a legal route that can be taken to challenge those amendments in the Constitutional Court. And it has happened. In fact, the banning of child marriages in Zimbabwe was achieved because 2 young girl brides took the matter to the Constitutional Court. And the outcome of that court case was that of banning child marriages. So could be citizens who will say, we are taking this issue to the Constitutional Court to stop Constitutional Amendment number 2, because we don't, as citizens, that it is for our benefit. But if there is no one who stands up to say that cannot happen, then it means it will say, because the authorities will think that everyone is in support. So expressing our collective disgust at abuses helps the authorities to know. I'll give you another example. You know, with the one is arrested by the police, the way sometimes the police behave, they beat up people in custody and things like that. And there are some people who might actually think that, well, if you are in police custody, then that can happen. It's up to the police. But it's a violation of human rights. And we must say no to that. And we have got a robust media that must continue to expose these things. So when we go to the ground and say, this is what is happening, these are abuses, they need to be stopped. So it's a continuous struggle. We need to build networks. Yemurai, do not despair, do not lose hope, do not give up. We need to keep fighting for these rights. Form different networks, inform the authorities, inform the media that expose these things, and then collectively push for change. It will not just happen. And sometimes the pushing for change is not just with the ZANU-PF authorities. We also need to advocate for change with the opposition authorities so that we can have a collective bipartisan, non-partisan position that puts human rights first. So even with COVID-19, with vulnerable communities, with people not having access to medication, we must simply say, this is not politics, it is about our lives.
Right. Thank you so much, Koma Dewa, on that. We're going to take another short break briefly, and then we come back to go into the nuts and bolts as we conclude this discussion. Today is International Human Rights Day. It is also the last day of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. We'll come back after this short break. All right, welcome back. This is day 16 of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. We are saying these are just 16 days where we amplify the message, but the responsibility is for all of us to uphold and make sure that we prevent GBV at all costs. In the studio today, I have Mr. Dewa Mavhinga. He is a human rights lawyer and is helping us to find ways of asserting our rights and requesting, demanding that our rights are met. Right. Mkoma Dewa, I come back to you again. When we spoke in the last segment, we were talking about the rights of a person who's been arrested. Now, I want to come to that because I think we have seen a very sad scenario in our courts, especially when members of the opposition or those perceived to be opposing the government are arrested. We see them coming at court in handcuffs and leg irons, and yet people who are actually on trial over cases to do with siphoning the country of resources that would benefit everyone else. They have a more relaxed arresting they waltz into court, and they demand for bail, they get it, they go home, and boom, 60 million is gone from the coffers. And somebody who attacks somebody, verbally or something, they come to court in handcuffs, like we've seen with Tendai Biti, the MDC Alliance Vice President, as we saw with Hopo Chingono, as we saw with Takuzo Ngadzore. They would come to court in handcuffs. I mean, who is supposed to come to court in handcuffs?
Well, in terms of the human rights of arrested and detained persons, these are provided for the Constitution of Zimbabwe. The problem there is of compromised state institutions. Where you have individuals who are partisan and politicized and loyal to ZANU-PF, for example. It means that those individuals are applying the law selectively, number one, and number two, sometimes they use the law, weaponize the law to persecute opponents and government critics. So there is what is called persecution through prosecution, and it has been happening in Zimbabwe. But the primary problem is that we have partisan individuals who are in roles where we expect the individuals to be impartial, to be independent, and to be loyal to the Constitution of Zimbabwe. So the problem is loyalty to ZANU-PF and a perception that those who are opposed to ZANU-PF are so-called enemies of the state. For a long time, ZANU-PF was pursuing a desire to have a one-party state in Zimbabwe. It has failed, but de facto, Zimbabwe is a one-party state. De facto, you have individuals. If you saw the ZANU-PF District Coordination Council Committee elections, a number of government officials were participating in those elections. Headmasters, or prosecutors, a magistrate, Mount Darwin even, standing on a ZANU-PF card. And this is a violation of their terms of conditions of their jobs, their contracts, but they do it because there is no accountability. They do it is impunity. They do it because, every time, the magistrates make grave errors of the law. It's taken to the High Court. The High Court says this was a grave error. The magistrates misdirect themselves. But there is no punishment for that magistrate. There is no accountability. These are effectively ZANU-PF functionaries. So that you have ZANU-PF functionaries in the police, in the prosecution, in the magisterial courts, in the High Court, even in the prisons. And these are designed to punish and persecute and harass, critics. This has happened with Hopo Chingono, with Jacob Ngarivume, with Namatai Kwekwe, with Joanna Mamombe, Cecilia Chimbiri Netsai Marova, with Otindaibiti. All these people have been harassed primarily because they are viewed as government opponents. So we need to take Zimbabwe to a point, where state institutions are separate from political institutions, where individuals who serve the government are loyal to the constitution and not to ZANU-PF. And I have said this is the primary problem in Zimbabwe, because when people look at you as a person, they don't value your rights as an individual, but they value your association with a political party. And that's problematic. And it means that we cannot resolve our human rights challenges if we do not rise above party differences. As a result, we have found that prisons have become a place to punish government opponents and away, the big thieves, the big criminals that are looting state resources in Zimbabwe.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for that. I think it's a really sad indictment on the call for political, reforms in our country. The very fact that institutions that are meant to hold the society together are the very same institutions that are being used to separate and, show that difference. If you're associated with the ruling party, for example, the treatment becomes different. When you're associated with a voice that is irritating the ruling party, you are punished for that. I mean, it doesn't make sense that Hopo Chingono had to spend 45 days or even 2 weeks in prison for allegations. There was not even investigations or anything that was done. So we need to get to a point as a nation where we deal with our politics. Mr. Mavhinga, maybe if you've got last words or just maybe a word of advice, a word of encouragement to our nation. If we are to deal with gender-based violence, even in the home, in the schools, as we've been talking 16 days, the last 15 days, we have been talking with various stakeholders from different organizations on the need to fight GBV at all costs. But what we then realize is it rises and falls on the government. It rises and falls on the political will to make sure that things begin to move. What will be your last words before we round up this conversation to the people of Zimbabwe?
Well, to the people of Zimbabwe, I say, do not be afraid to speak up for your rights. Do not be afraid to assert your rights and to challenge ZANU-PF or any authority. Do not believe for a moment that the small efforts do not matter. They do matter. So speak out, come together, be a collective. Sometimes there is unity, there is safety, there is protection in numbers. So preach the gospel of human rights, come together and challenge the status quo all the time together. Change is coming.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Mavhinga, for gracing our platform to talk about this very important matter.
Great pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zimbabwe, for joining us. This is Zimbabwe Daily, and today we are we were talking about the need to deal decisively with human rights issues so that we also address gender-based violence. Zimbabwe, we can do this. It has been 16 days of amplified talk around GBV issues, but you and I know that the responsibility lies within us to make sure that 365 and a quarter days we are addressing and removing everything that drives us to gender-based violence. Thank you so much, Zimbabwe. Thank you so much to all of you. Yemurai, thank you so much for your efforts and continually showing up. We really appreciate it when you join us. Thank you, Zimbabwe. God bless you. And let's meet again on another show. You have been wonderful.